never stop and really think about strategy until the very end of the season. So that'll be
Yeah,
fun.
I think we have one more person joining.
Perfect.
Okay, I think the live is running well. Rishi, if you could turn on your camera. Hey, so I think we'll give it a few minutes
Hello.
for people to roll in, but in the meantime, we can just exist. But let me pull it up on my laptop too.
I keep trying to adjust my monitor because I had it up on some U channel, and then I was working on like a bike project, and I was like, oh man, it'd be really handy, a couple of pieces of U channel, and then I had them because they were holding up my monitor for 5 years, and I was like, oh, I'm gonna steal those now, and now my monitor is like on random things that have collected underneath this U channel. So
Almost.
very Ethan from Gobilda. We eat our own dog food a lot around here.
You know, um, that happens at our team's coach's desk.
Mm,
All her whole. You know how every single package from Gobilda gives you one of those
yes,
measuring tools? She has like
yes.
100 million of them just scattered everywhere. So yeah, it's
We've talked about other ideas for how to mix that up a little bit and make it so it isn't just always the measuring tool. But
mhm.
every one I design, I'm like, man, this isn't as good as the measuring tool. I'm like, this is kind of cool. Like one of them was a gear sizer. Like you could hold it up to a gear and say, oh, this is this many teeth. I'm like, that's kind of cool.
Yeah,
But it is also just kind of a measuring device, and you could totally just do this with a measuring tool. So
yeah.
there are a couple ideas that we've had that I like a little bit better, but most of the time you're like, oh man, I've invented the wheel again. All right, back to square one.
Yeah, I definitely like that new quad lock that you guys put out. That was really cool.
Oh, um,
Like the one with those like you could put the shaft in it, like the 8 Rex shaft, and
mm-hmm.
it gets I don't know how to explain, but dead axled like if you put it inside.
Okay, okay. Yes,
Yeah.
we had a bunch of because you could always do something like that with pattern spacers where you have two bearings and you can constrain everything, and it's nice for it to be press fit where you don't have to think about the bearings
Yeah, for
potentially
sure.
moving out. I like those a lot.
Mhm.
It's always fun.
Um
The mechanical stuff's always cool.
yeah, it is. So, I think we're gonna just go ahead and get started. I think
Sweet.
we'll let people roll in over time, but hi everyone, I'm Neil Mitchell from Don't Blink, FTC Team 14481. This is First Tech Challenge Rookie Rescue, and today we're going to be taking a deep dive into game strategy. Today we're here joined by Ethan from Gobilda. Ethan Doak is involved in First in many ways, professionally as a mechanical engineer, designing parts that end up on FTC robots, to being an Oklahoma head referee and an FTC alum. He started FTC in 2015 in the rescue season and has been here ever since. So if you want to add anything to that, Ethan, you should definitely go ahead. But
I it's funny that I sometimes think about. I was thinking about this the other day. Like, oh man, I haven't missed a championship since Velocity Vortex. Like, I've been to every single world since Velocity Vortex. Like, this was my life in high school, and then hey, I have an opportunity to do this more, and that's amazing. So it's kind of
yeah,
fun that now we're getting pretty close to this being my 10th year in first, which is just kind of crazy
wow,
to think about.
yeah, that's true.
And going from like, oh yeah, the first year I was in FTC, I put together a Tetrix push bot, and that was the whole thing I did for like a couple of months, and then I started
Yeah,
getting more and more into it, and now okay, yeah, I'm the head referee, and I design parts that go on that team's robot, which is really fun. It's like, oh yeah, the sock monkeys still have parts from that I've designed. It's just is at a fully different capacity. So
yeah,
it's lovely. I love being at events and designing stuff and being able to be a little pieces of so many different teams experience. It's great.
yeah. And Rishi, do you want to introduce yourself really quick?
Hello, I'm Rishi. I'm on 14481 Don't Blink, and I'm a programmer.
Nice to meet you, Rishi. So let's hop right um, into the game this year. So I think everyone knows that we are dealing with Into the Deep. Do you guys have any thoughts on this year's game? Anything that you particularly dislike or like? Let's hear from both of you. Ethan, if you want to go first, you should.
Sure. One of my favorite things is that have been a lot of little changes that stick people up.
Mm,
I I think my favorite part is just the new layout for the competition manual is so nice. Everything feels so clean. And I refereed my first event last weekend, and man, it felt so much easier to teach people. It was like, okay, I get how this works. I get the rules a little faster. There are
yeah,
some things that like the expansion limit that are not super clear, but I think it's been really nice. I like how simple this game is in a lot of ways. Last year, it felt like everything was thrown at it. Like, okay, yeah, you hang
yeah,
an end game and you also shoot a drone and you score points in three different ways. And
yeah, yeah.
it's fun to have games that are so deep and so like mechanically complex. But I like every once in a while having a game that is really interesting and fun and has unique challenges, but is primarily pretty simple.
Mm, yeah, for sure. And what about you, Rishi?
I think this game is also really good. I think, as Ethan was saying, this competition manual, it's really organized. I
Mm,
think putting it in one manual really organizes everything. It's easier to find whatever is needed, right? So if you want to
Yeah.
search it out, you can easily go and search it out,
mm,
and you don't have to remember whether it's in manual one or manual two. Makes your life much easier. And in terms of the game, yes, I agree. Even though it seems more simple, right? In some ways, I think it is. There's a lot of opportunity for this to be much more complicated, as especially I think we'll go and talk more about this, but the amount of randomness that is there inside the submersible really adds a challenge
yeah,
in
for
many
sure.
ways.
Yeah, it's a fun. I like the skill curve because, and I think it hits it really well. So you have a game that is in principle very simple, and getting to 80% of the game is pretty straightforward. You get how you get there. You make a pretty good intake. You make a pretty good deposit, and you can get to cycling very well. But
Hmm.
then, okay, top 20% is really hard because now you have to find a sample in submersible. Like that's tough. Localizing a
Yeah.
robot this year isn't super easy. Like there aren't April tags right there that make scoring as clean. And Specimen and Autonomous is such a fun challenge for those like really high level teams. And it's
Hmm.
something that I never thought I would see really is like, okay, now your autonomous robot is interacting with a human player. Like that's cool.
That's
I really
crazy.
like that the depth is complicated and the breadth is simple. Most teams hit a really simple game that is very achievable and you get how to achieve and work through. And then it's that very like upper echelon of teams that are finding the stuff that's very hard.
Hmm. So, like, if we wanted to dive deeper into the submersible and picking things up, it's something that our team has kind of had difficulty with this season
Yeah.
because in the beginning, we were really opting for an active intake, and not necessarily that we fully switched, but I think active is usually the faster choice, but we're kind of having difficulty with okay, how do we get both of our maybe gecko wheels or all of our intake in there and get it into like a proper location? And I don't know, like I just with all the variability in the submersible, it's kind of difficult to see how that will end up working out. So, what do you guys think about that?
Yeah, like going through. So I was a big part of designing our starter kit robot for this year. So at
Hmm.
Gobilda, we have a robot that is meant so you can follow instructions to build something that can play the game. And we really wanted an active intake. Active intakes are the way almost every time in FTC. Like it makes a robot that's much easier to drive. It requires a lot less precision in autonomous and in teleop in your drivers. So we said, man, that's the goal. That's the gold standard. And the geometry there is tough and like very small changes in the geometry of that intake go from an intake that works to an intake that absolutely never does. So it's a funky game to fine tune, and for us it was weird to fine tune with a limited number of parts that already exist in the kit. I think
Hmm.
it's probably easier when you can say, okay, I can make anything. I have a 3D printer.
Hmm.
But still, like that prototyping process of finding the right geometry that ends you up with like creates a good intake is hard. And for a lot of teams, there are pretty good solutions to making a claw very good.
Yeah.
Some insight into the design process for our starter kit robot is we would build an intake and say, okay, we have an intake. What do I score in 2.5 minutes? What do we score in 2 minutes? I think is what we did. How many
Hmm.
from the submersible into the low basket? How many samples are we scoring? And the bone stock off the shelf generic any season starter kit robot with a claw was scoring 6 or so in the low basket, and the one we
Hmm.
ended up with an active intake maybe got 8. Like,
Oh, okay.
claws are
So
really pretty good. And
yeah.
if you're good at driving a robot, you can make them very good. And I kind of expect really high level teams or teams who are willing to dedicate a lot of time to driver practice to be really successful with claws. I think they're a great solution to this challenge.
Yeah. I definitely agree. I think one thing that I think we'll see a lot of this season is like automation of the angle of your claw and seeing like, okay, you're at this point. Now the thing that's right under us is here, so we need to
Mm-hmm.
angle this much this way. But I think something that will be a little scary for claw is that like many people are using those indents or those cavities in the samples to grab each piece. But let's say you have like three pieces or three samples that are right next to each other, right? How are you supposed to get the one in the middle? And this is
Yeah.
like obviously comes down to high level play, but I'm just interested to see what happens when we get there. What's going to
Yeah,
actually happen.
yeah. And speaking of those indents, I remember after the game released, right? I think within a week or two, a lot of teams came out with these 3D printed designs for those claws, which you take advantage of those indents and put sort of like a pyramid shape in the claw itself, so that it easily picks up. And when it picks up, also it aligns in a way where it would be easier to, so that it aligns in the direction that you want it to, and it can really account for a little bit of error, which which I thought was really interesting. And I think a lot uh, the claw, right? It's really easy to get working, right, compared to the active intake,
Yeah.
and I've seen a lot of teams use it, and I think it's a very nice idea. If you have if and they have access to a 3D printer, they can. I think a lot of the files are also available online, which is really nice.
Yeah. Um,
I'm really interested to see. I think there's an interesting trend in FTC generally, which I think the best way to think about it is a lot of teams follow gluten free. A lot of teams follow the best team in the world. They see in
yeah.
February or whenever you see that really great team, you say, "Oh, I need to do that." And I think there will be a lot of that with intakes and stuff like that this year.
Hmm.
And that's always an interesting phenomenon because I think you see teams who might maybe shouldn't, because the magic in so many of those designs is the software. It's the okay, this is a claw, yeah, but I think about oh um man, I forgot this team. They were a Washington team in Freight Frenzy that just had a claw, and that was their active intake. Was reach down and you have a computer vision alignment with an element, and you had a claw based intake that was as fast as active intakes were that year. I think it was height differential, um, and the magic in the system is the software. It's the hey, I'm finding that element that I want to grab, and I'm automating the claw position. And I think that's going to be the magic behind a lot of very good claws this year. Is the software side that makes it so that a driver doesn't have to be perfect. That was
Yeah.
the thing that differentiated and pushed me to make a really solid active intake for the starter kit robot over a claw, because I think the ceiling in that kit is probably higher with a claw if you have Ethan from Gobilda driving the robot. But if you have average rookie driver driving the robot, it's a lot harder. I have been driving robots for 10 years, and most people haven't. Nobody in
Yeah.
FTC should be able to. So there's definitely like there are a lot of things that I can get away with in a design because I know I can practice the robot really well. And most teams should look at that and say, let's try to minimize the potential for a driver error. Let's give them as much flexibility as possible, whether that's in a claw that has a lot of good software support, or if that's an active intake that has really good geometry that pulls an element into it.
Yeah. I think I think active intake is almost always the way to go, especially for rookie teams because it's just so much easier. And I think the active intake that Gobilda or Ethan employed was really. really really intuitive because it seemed to work even when like your intake it seemed to work in all types of places. So it was actually really interesting to see the geometry of the claw or
Mhm.
of the intake and see that like I think the was your gecko wheel or like
Mhm.
your wheel was kind of in front of your platform a little bit.
It is, yeah. You very much hit the wheel before you ever hit the platform, and that
Hmm.
platform is basically as far away from the wheel as you can get, where there's still a wheel that's touching the element while the
At
element touches the
a certain
platform.
point. Yeah.
It's very late in the process, and
Hmm.
I see that a lot. This is very in the weeds in designing active intakes, but I see that a lot because the hard part about an active intake is getting that element off the ground. Like nothing ever comes close to, man, it's so annoying to get this element off the ground into the robot. Once in the robot, it's easy. Getting it into possession of the robot is easy, but getting it to go up in the robot every single time is the hardest part. And you see a trend in our robot in 3 days, at least, where we try not to do that. So a lot of games, we have an active intake, but it never leaves the floor until there's a claw or something there that picks it up right off the floor. um, where and I think one of the ways that really makes it easier to design an active intake is trying to put the wheel way out further than the ramp. A lot of teams will have a wheel right over a ramp, and it makes it tough for the wheel to get enough bite to pull it up into the robot.
Yeah.
So there's and like so much of that is just prototype. Like we
Hmm.
built so many intakes and we didn't have a lot of time to build that robot. So
Yeah.
it was a lot of like, okay, we have to throw this intake together right now and see if it works. And if it doesn't seem like it's going to work, we have to redo it. So there's a lot of prototyping, and I don't think there's a foolproof system to say, hey, this geometry for an intake is going to work and this one won't. So much of it is how well does this work in real life?
Yeah. I think for any rookie team, prototyping is definitely like the most
Mm-hmm.
important thing, especially when it comes to intakes. I think our intake mechanism is probably one of the most remade mechanisms throughout all of our seasons, whether it
Mm-hmm.
comes to Freight Frenzy, Power Play, even, or especially Center Stage, because Center Stage was so difficult. It was so difficult to pick up those pixels because it seemed that like they were sliding. Right, we even employed having the rollers farther out. But even when the rollers were further out, it still didn't seem to be good at picking it up onto a ramp or picking it up onto something that would eventually lift it up.
Yeah, and like the
Well,
struggle with the center stage elements is that they are so short compared to how long they are. Like
yeah,
a lot of times with the ramp, one of the most effective intake systems principles is you have an element, it hits a ramp on your robot, and
and
it
it
pivots up.
rolls.
And
Yeah,
you can't do that with an element that is
nope.
this thin and this long.
Yeah,
So that was hard. A lot of times you have to have a counter rotating roller to pick it up off the
yes.
ground. You saw
Hmm.
that in Ultimate Goal too.
Yeah,
So a lot of those intakes are just harder. But a lot of the games where the elements look something like this are also the hardest ones to avoid having an active intake. Also, I
yeah,
shout out um, 16597 for giving me this giant pixel at Worlds. I love it. It sits on my desk. It's great.
yeah. That's amazing. Maybe you should
Oh,
use
those
that under your
you just
desk.
hang up.
Yeah, I really am tempted to 3D print big all like elements for all the games because it's very fun,
Yeah,
but
at that
it's great.
scale is crazy. That's bigger than your face.
It's
Nice, nice
it's
job.
like I don't think I could put this on my under three. I think this is bigger than my build bay.
Yeah. Um, okay, so now let's get a little bit into where are we scoring, right? We've kind of covered submersible, intake hard, but what are we doing after we score, right? I think the amount of points for specimen is 10, and then the amount of points for the high bucket is 8, and this is referring to both the high chamber and the high bucket. So, um, what do you guys think about the difficulty difference between scoring on specimen versus sample, and then we can go into early game versus or early season versus late season, and we can talk about that right now. So, what do you guys think? Uh, yeah.
I'm really interested to see. So one of my favorite games is Rover Ruckus. Rover Ruckus had, and the
Mm,
dynamic that I really liked about Rover Ruckus is that you had a robot that was good at one thing and a robot that was good at another thing, and those two
yeah.
robots meshed really well together. But a lot of times, Robot B does not do Robot A's game very well at all. I've been
Mm-hmm.
very interested to see because FTC is different than it was in 2019. In 2018 and 19, that was the complexity of an FTC robot was just lower. It was harder to get something like a linear slide working. Like that was a huge achievement for so many teams. Was okay. Now I can make linear motion. Amazing. I had no idea that like this had never been possible before. So that specialty where you say I'm going to do just this side and I'm going to build a robot that's great at just this part of the game made a lot of sense. And I want to know if that is true this
Hmm.
year. Like, will you have robots that really
Oh,
specialize in samples and then really specialize in specimens? Or will everybody be able to do both? I think
yeah,
one of the most valuable things you could do right now as a team deciding the direction you want to go is focus on specimen. I think specimen are going to be less generally. I think teams are not going to focus on them as much. And I think that they are a really fast way to score points if you're good at them. Now, it's really hard to have two robots score specimen. So if that's your one thing, you are going to have matchups in qualification matches where you're not going to be as good because you have two robots that might specialize in the same thing. But I
yeah,
think that most teams will focus on samples, and I think that that's going to be the way to get more points for a lot of the season. But having robots that are good at both is where I think we're going to end up later down the road.
yeah. That's actually a really fair point. I think scoring specimen, although it's really hard, might be the better move because many people are not going to go for it. But I think it's
Mhm.
just it just takes so long. Like compared to the sample, like
Yeah.
this is something that I feel like. Or correct me if I'm wrong. I didn't play um, until Freight Frenzy, so I'm kind of a
Mhm.
newbie myself. But um, was there ever a game where we placed and then picked up again? Like place
Yeah.
something in a space, the human
Mhm.
player picked it up and then put it down again.
No. And that's been some really interesting changes to the rules this year because previously, like as a ref, one of the rules that is the hardest to get through people's head is previously, not this year. If you put down an element, you have to leave it down. You can't reach back in and adjust it. Or this year you can. And a lot of those rules have to exist that way because of the mechanism by which you're picking up a sample and turning it into a specimen. So this is totally new for human players, and I think it's cool. It
Yeah,
allows stuff like the human player interacting with robots and autonomous in a new way. Um, I think I'm excited as a ref because it's one more rule that feels like a gotcha that we don't have to call. But I do
yeah,
think it opens up strategies really well.
yeah. What do you think, Rishi, about the whole specimen thing?
Even like to be honest, even though it's worth more points, right? The amount of time it takes, I think it's a lot more time compared to the reward that you get, right? It's a lot more work that you have to put in. And I think Ethan was talking about Rover Ruckers, but
Mm-hmm.
like I think one of the more recent examples that some might remember is probably Freight Frenzy, where
Mm,
there's a lot of specialization as well.
yep.
Where like I think one of them would focus on the shared hub, and then one of them would focus on the alliance specific hub. And I agree that even though like qualification matches, you don't it's all based on luck, but then when it gets to like eliminations and playoff matches, right, then
Yep.
teams will have to like really do scouting very well, and they have to be really careful and wise about who they're picking, and they have to choose a complement. And that's also a good thing about this year is that there's not much clashing of the robots as
Mm-hmm.
there used to be, right? So like I remember last year they put backboards on one side, and then they put the human player stations on the exact diagonal, so that
Yes.
there was so much clashing and there was so much like contact between the robots. It made playing the game practically impossible, right? And I think that was one of the biggest challenges to come across. It's just how do we teach the driver, because the drivers, right, when you practice, there aren't other robots on the field, and that makes it really hard. That there's a huge change when it
Yeah,
comes to practicing
Mm-hmm.
and then actually going into the competition. And that's what I think is really nice about this year is that you don't really have to worry about that as much. And that's why I think like it's really important to choose the specialization. You should either like
Yeah.
be really good at hanging the specimens, or really good at like putting the samples in the baskets. And I think one of the major rule changes that came out like a few weeks, maybe 3 4 weeks back, is that now robots can carry as many clips as they want, which completely changes the game. Because like now, if a team is able to do that, right, just store the clips and then use them, then I think at that point the work put into putting a sample right on, or the time that's put in for the sample is much less than the time that is put in for sorry, the time put in for a specimen is much less for a time than the time put in for a sample, right? Which makes that much more valuable in a
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah, if teams can get that idea where you are picking up a sample, you are storing some large number of clips in your robot, and you're creating specimens in your robot, that could be so powerful. I'm so interested to see if that works out. I'm fascinated. I don't know. I think that there will be teams that do it. If I had to guess right now, and I think I'm going to be wrong, I'm not going to bet any cheeseburgers on whether or not this happens. I think this feels a lot like Skystone. You had all these blocks and you stacked them up, and there was a point where it was really annoying to build enough linear slides to get to the top, and it was technically legal for you to grab the whole stack and pick it up and then insert a block under it. I feel like it is, yeah, it feels technically possible to build a robot that can store a bunch of clips and make specimen, but I kind of doubt anybody but like one or two teams will do it. It feels like it's going to be really hard, and I don't know if it works. It breaks the game and it's amazing. Like it's so good, but I think it's going to be such a difficult technical challenge that I don't think anybody's going to be able to pull it off. I hope I'm wrong because it's so cool, but I kind of doubt it.
Have you seen any teams do that for Skystone?
There was one team that I remember that did that. One team did pick up the entire stack and put one under, and it was cool, and it was a great technical challenge. Like it was a great technical achievement to be able to do that, but it wasn't as competitive.
Uh,
So there is some like internal weight in your team to say, hey, we might pick to do what a lot of us feel like is the like less technically competitive option, but we're making a really cool robot, and that's what FTC is about. So 4042 is a team that I always look at as doing that amazingly well. They built robots that extended and broke into multiple pieces, or robots that like catapulted a yoga ball to score it, and
Oh,
ball
yeah.
drive, and all these really cool ideas that were not ever as competitive as the traditional FTC comfortable option, but always push the boundaries in really cool ways.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the most interesting things for me, differentiating between samples and specimens, is samples are an FTC thing. Like everybody who's played 3 or 4 FTC games thinks about gets how to score samples. They make sense. It feels like a lot of other games we've played. You have an extending intake, you grab an element, you transfer it, you have a vertical outtake, and you score it. Where like specimen are different. Specimen don't feel like an FTC challenge, which I think is one of the things that makes them exciting for me. And I think it's one of the ways that rookie teams can really stand out is I think it's simpler to make a robot that's very good at scoring specimen, and I think a lot of teams aren't going to have that part of their alliance.
Yeah, I think specimen is going to be really difficult, and definitely like making a clip bot will be extremely difficult. But if a team can get it done, that'll be amazing.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think well, another topic that's kind of interesting this season will be defense. So I think you're able to pick up um, samples from any part of the submersible, right? From any side. So how
Mm-hmm.
do you guys think that's going to work? I think most teams or like most of the blue side will stay on their side and most of the red will stay on theirs. But I'm just interested to see if there will be defense, if there will be robot to robot, and what you guys think about that.
I kind of expect how I feel like this game is going to shake out as teams are scoring more and more elements. Is that right now? I think you see those specimen teams collecting from the side of the submersible, so the same side that they're scoring
Yeah.
specimen on. I think that that's going to get harder and harder because of the extension limit. The extension limit stops you from reaching very far into that side. So I think that teams are going to have to start going to the side of the submersible, like the front and back where you hang, and I think what we'll see is a blue robot and a red robot both on the same side of the submersible on one side, where one's scoring samples and one's scoring specimen, and the opposite. And I think that there's where you're going to get some robot interaction. I think for a lot of the season, you're going to see robot interaction only in the first 5 seconds or 30 seconds, even when teams are trying to get the opposing alliance's neutral specimens or neutral samples. Those feel so
Mm.
valuable. Like if you can go to the opposing alliance and grab their neutral samples, those are so fast to score compared to every other game element on the field that grabbing even one of those feels like a swing. So I think you're going to see robot to robot interaction. I saw that at league meet that I was a head ref at, where teams want those opposing alliance neutral samples and they want them as soon as they can because they're worth a lot. Um,
Mhm.
so I think you're going to see robot interaction there. I think later in the season you're going to see robot interaction at the specimen or at the submersible as teams are intaking. But I generally agree this is a pretty low robot to robot contact game, and I don't think that there's a big advantage to doing it. I feel like a lot of FTC, if you can score more points, you win. Like it's so hard to effectively play defense in 2v2 that it's almost never worth really trying to figure out how to do it well because it's generally not worth your time.
Definitely, it's definitely a lot less than, or I think the most issues with robots getting like touching each other will be when they're in the submersible. Maybe
Mm-hmm.
their extension is touching another extension, so it'll be kind of scary when one of your teammates is going into the chamber side and the other is going into the ascent side. So
Yeah.
that will be something interesting to see how it all works out and whether teams figure out a way to intake both at the same time pretty like easily without any issues.
Yeah,
But
I think practice with other robots is going to be different this year.
it's
I think
mhm.
the games are going to look different in 2 months than they do today. Like, we will see Michigan State in December, where we have a bunch of world class robots that are 2 months early, and I think that's what the game is going to look like. And I doubt that most regions are going to see gameplay like Michigan State until February. So if you're a team that's trying to get the edge, watch every event you can out of Michigan because their season is shorter. They have a pressure to get that robot done faster. And man, it makes competitive robots so early, even though they're almost all middle schoolers. Like that's been true for almost as long as I've been in FTC. Like you are
Mm.
shocked every single December that Michigan is as good as they are. And then you look 2 months down the road and you say, oh, they were ahead of the game. That's how we play the game today.
Yeah, that's gonna be really interesting to see. Actually, I didn't know about Michigan State.
They're so competitive every year and they keep getting more competitive. So I'm excited because that's the fun one to watch. You get this like preview. What's the world's gonna look like? You see it in Michigan State. It's such a competitive region and it's so early. So that's what I keep an eye out for. And if your state's in February or even early March, you have some time. Like you could watch a state championships in mid-December and make some strategic changes. So that's always a really key part of a lot of like team seasons, I think, is let's see this preview of how the game is going to be played at a really high level.
Yeah. I think there was a question in the chat actually. Uh,
Yeah.
what do you think about designing for the barrier at the edge of the submersible? Yeah. So what do you guys think about that? I think at least from our edge, we're just going to be trying to um, have our extendo or linear slides that are going outwards horizontally be like a couple of millimeters above that submersible, that 2 inches, and
Mhm.
then have an arm at the end or some type of intake that will pick up a sample.
It's
What do you think?
difficult. Like the hardest elements to get on the field are the ones that are right up next to that edge. Like getting a sample away from the edge far enough for your intake to reach down and
Uh,
get it is tough. That's the place that like so you have I think for a lot of teams you have intakes that rely on being close to the ground and then running into an element, and you have intakes that rely on being above an element and dropping down. That's the
mhm.
advantage is if you can get an element right up next to that barrier wall. I think those are the hardest ones to get to. Now, I don't think you'll need to get to them a lot of the time. A lot of for almost all the season, those aren't critical, but they're hard. They're tough to get to. And like in the starter robot, that was the driving that robot to be able to get those ones that are right up next to the wall is tough. Having the full 42 inches of extension forward helps because it gives you a much greater pool of those samples to try to get when you don't have to spend a lot of time navigating getting those up from against the wall.
You know, it's kind of interesting, like picking up those samples that are close to the submersible wall might be kind of the move because then you can get rid of the samples that the other team might be picking up from their side, which
Yeah,
is
there's always
yeah,
that push, like in FTC and elements in games like this. You see robots push all the elements slowly away from themselves as they're intaking them. I think a lot of intakes just naturally you run into an element, you don't quite get it right, you spit it out, and you go for the next one. So you have a
yeah,
lot. I think you'll see a lot of samples pushed up against those walls, and if you're good at it, that's great. It's hard to design an intake for because a lot of those like strictly vertical intakes that reach down and grab something need some clearance between the element and the wall. So we had a prototype for a truly like vertical drop down intake for the starter kit robot, and it worked very well. But it was really easy to accidentally grab the barrier on the submersible. Like you would
yeah,
just almost intake it every time, and you're like, "Oh man, this is a pain. We shouldn't do this because it's hard to drive."
yeah. We have some more questions. What do you think about the horizontal limit this year? Rishi, we haven't heard from you. What do you think?
Um, Although it may be a little bit annoying to work with, right? I think it's very good that they put it in because it really pushes teams to like try and because I feel like if there was no horizontal limit, I think the entire submersible would be empty by like halfway through the match, and then robots will just be like running around the field, right? With nothing to do, just waiting for Endgame whistle to blow, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I think that the horizontal limit is a good thing, even though it may be a little bit annoying to work with, and I like that they put it in. Although the only thing that some teams have to watch out is that even when hanging, the horizontal limit has to be met,
Mm-hmm.
and so the 20 inch, that's generally the 20-inch width. That's generally what teams have to be watch out for when hanging, and I think that's probably the most difficult part about it. But other than that, I think it's a good thing that they put it in.
Yeah,
I think it feels like the first year for a rule like this. There are some implementation holdups that I think don't make sense to a lot of teams. Um, but I also think we're gonna get past that next year, and it's gonna feel a lot less jarring if we have it again. That's one of the things that I'm excited about this rule is that it doesn't feel like it's here every year. Like we had weight limits for a little while in FTC, and then they kind of went away. And it just depends on the game. If the game demands this, then it's better. I think that this is a much better game than if we didn't have extension limits, but they are different. They change how you design robots. They change the kinds of things you watch out for. And I know, like the league meet I started, we started about an hour behind because it's tough. A lot of teams aren't expecting that rule to act the way it does. So it was we had a lot of teams who had to change their robots up to be able to comply with that because they interpreted it in a different way. So I'm excited. I think it's good, but there are growing pains with it for sure.
yeah. Um, what do we think about? Oh, okay. So here's an interesting question.
Mm-hmm.
Um, what are the thoughts about level three ascent versus just going for a couple more cycles? And do you think going for a couple more cycles is worth it, or level three ascent? I know my coach is always saying to be a world class team, you need to have a hang, and I think she's right. I think if you're a world class team, you need to have all the components of the game to be successful. But at least for these early meets, what do you guys think about just cycling a little bit more during endgame versus getting that hang off? And maybe like, does it depend on the amount of time that it takes to hang, or where you're hanging and stuff like that? So, what do you guys think? Uh,
This is the thing I'm most excited about. Like the single, like the piece of the meta that's going to shake out because I think it's 5 more points to get a level 3 ascent versus level 2 ascent, and it's hard. And it's probably an additional mechanism. It's probably one more motor to be able to do a level 3 hang. So when the math is okay, this is still less points than one more cycle. It has to be faster than one more cycle. Or you have to be counting as a really high level team on elements getting really scarce by the end of the season. So
mhm.
I'm excited. I think it's very interesting. I think we'll be interested to see like how many teams end up going for that level 3.
Yeah, I think it's 15 extra, but
Oh, okay. Okay.
I think that's still it's kind of the same
Still
kind
in
of
that
concept.
range.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to do a low, if teams want to do a level three ascent over cycling, actually, even if they want to like balance out, right? I think they have to be able to hang, do a level three ascent in such a short time, like maybe under 5 seconds ish, right? Otherwise, I don't even think it's worth it to go for that because I feel like tumor cycles are much more achievable, and that would be actually one extra point, and then you go and directly hang for the level two. Like
Yeah.
5 to 10 seconds is around the time that it should take.
And like,
Um,
yeah, that's possible. We saw a team, I think it's just under 5 seconds, do a level three. Now there is some pretty specific mechanisms for that hang, but and it requires some practice. But I do think it's possible. I think if you are 5 seconds solidly every time, it's probably worth it. But I think that's a lot of that team's season. The other thing you see is that's a Michigan team. They're ahead of it, and they have to be because they don't have time in their season. Like their
yeah.
season is chugging along. They have a month and a couple of weeks. They have like 5 weeks left, so
They have
they're
to be
ahead.
locked in.
So
Yeah.
that's those are the teams you have to keep an eye on today. Is okay, what are they doing? And I think we will probably see it toward the end of the season. But I would say if you're trying to do well at league meets and even the league championships in most regions, if you have a good auto, you're done. Like I think somebody mentioned that in the chat. If you have a good autonomous, you're gonna outscore almost every team almost every time.
Yeah, I think to answer your question, um, Pranav or Pranav,
Mm-hmm.
um, it's always, I think it's always, almost always really helpful to have a good auto because those points are counted twice. So it's just like, it's really helpful because it gives you that immediate edge. And if you're that one team in your early season that has a good auto, it goes a really long way. And
Yeah.
I haven't been watching like that much game tape yet, but I don't think that many teams have like super crazy autos yet. And I think early season a 1+3 or even just a specimen hang is like really awesome.
I think that's going to make the difference in a lot of matches. It's also an
Yeah.
important tiebreaker. If you end up with a match tiebreak score, that's really important.
Yeah.
I wanted to shout out that level three ascent I was talking about that was right under 5 seconds is team 10136. So if you want to see one of those, that's who I'd check out.
Yeah.
One of my favorite rule changes this year is that you can now stop your autonomous and you don't have a penalty for it. So if you have an autonomous like that that's multi-cycle, you're going for a lot of stuff, and you find out that it's controlling two or it's careening toward the other opposing alliance's robots, hit the stop button, and you don't get penalized for it. What I like about it is it allows you as a team to push the boundaries just that little bit more without a lot of fear that you're going to get three major fouls and end up with a bunch of penalties that you can never crawl out of because you pushed too hard in your auto. So it's nice. You have a little bit more wiggle room now where you can hit stop and it's okay. And you haven't accrued those penalties as long as you're fast with it. So I will yell that at teams at an early league meet like, hey, if you think your robot's broken, hit the stop button. You're fine. You're allowed to.
Yeah. It's honestly a really nice thing. We had a couple
Mm-hmm.
autos where our robot went crazy last season, so it's definitely a good idea to include that.
Now you can just hit stop. It's
Yeah,
okay.
you
So
just hit stop. It
that's
all
a
works
great
out.
one to think about as you're designing autonomous is like, yes, you absolutely should always test and test and test and design for reliability and go for an auto that
Yeah.
works 100% of the time that scores one fewer cycle. That's what wins you events. Like I always look at Skystone for I was on a team called Recharge Green 7236 and they went into Skystone feeling really well, and going into their state championships they scored 4 cycles in autonomous where the really world class teams, the 2 or 3 that were really better, were going for 6. And they said, look,
Mm.
if we can have an autonomous that gets 4 every single time, that's better. And I do think that Data Force and gluten free autonomous probably would have worked every time. But they said, let's stop pushing it. Let's make this work every time. And let's let that speak for our robot. Let's
Yeah.
make sure we're always ahead and it works and not push for more than we know we can do. So absolutely try for
Mm.
reliability. That's the key to so many autonomouses, but now you have a little more flexibility. You have a little bit easier of a time saying, oh, I can push a little further and hit stop if it goes wrong.
Yeah. That's definitely a really great feature of the season.
Mm-hmm.
So do you guys have anything else you want to talk about specifically about this season, about this game? any of the rule changes, or are we
I
good?
think those are the big things. As a team at an event, make sure that you're, nice to your volunteers, ask your referees questions. If you're not sure on something, we're there to help. Like that's my favorite part about being a head referee is being able to stand in the question box and say, "Oh, yeah, here's how this works." And if I can have that conversation with you folks as students before that you found that penalty, that's so much better. So if you're not clear on a rule, ask other teams, ask on the First Tech Challenge Discord, or ask your referees at events because they're there to help you. They're there to have a good time, just like you are. I love FTC because it's fun to be there, and as a referee, it's easy to sometimes look at a ref and say, oh, they're just like enforcing the rules, and really, I'm there to have a good time too. So that's what I
Yeah,
always suggest to teams is if you're not sure or you have questions or your robot's not working quite right, ask a volunteer because we love the program too. We're here to help you guys have a great season. So
yeah. All right. Let's just take a look at the chat for any final questions. Uh, Compared to other games, how hard do you think this one is?
I think at the
Uh,
top level of FTC is always about as hard. Like the top level is always the hardest. And then I think you can really look at a game as how easy is it for a rookie team to play. This is one of my favorites because I think that it is you can get to a fairly competitive robot without as much complexity as you've had to have. So I think from that perspective, from the barrier to entry, it's easier. But I do think that the best teams are going to have robots that are just as technically impressive as they were last year and the year before. Like the magic in standing out in FTC is how much better is your robot, and that's always going to be hard.
yeah, that's a really great point. I think this season is well, I should think it's easy to some extent, but I kind of think that it'll be difficult for like in terms of intaking. Like
Mm-hmm. Yep.
that's where I'm really worried because if teams aren't going for that active intake and like their rookie drivers, I'm just worried that they won't be able to pick up the samples as easily. But other than that, I think this season is definitely catered to rookies and should be pretty easy early season.
Yep.
I think this is a perfect season for rookie teams to get started. This is actually by far the probably one of the best seasons in a while for rookie teams to get started. There's not much there's not as many rules
Mm-hmm.
to this game. It's much more simple, right? I think the autonomous is also a little bit easier with no randomization. Makes the software is
True.
easier. I think the mechanisms are also going to be much easier to work with. So as you guys said, yes, the entry barrier is much lower, right? It makes it's really good, right? So it allows more people to really embrace FTC and the first community, right? Be part of it and really learn together as a whole community. And again, at the top level, it's a completely different game.
Oh yes.
Yeah. All right. So thank you all for tuning in to First Tech Challenge Rookie Rescue. This is Don't Blink and Ethan Doak from Gobilda. Thank you so much, and we'll see you on the next one. Bye.
Right.